Okay, so voice is off. We should already have this slide.
Yeah, I think we're
Yeah. Okay, so
when I tell you to press enter.
all right, so we are talking about the beginning of this country as we know it to be America. But we should know that there were people who were already here. So we're talking just about when Christopher Columbus discovered it and it became America. So, and this was just before slavery. And so, we're going to talk about why slavery was needed in the first place. But just know that slavery existed all the way since biblical times and all over the world. So white people enslaving Africans was not the only type of slavery by any means. Okay, so we're only talking about it because it relates to America. Okay, so you should have this down by now. So the year was 1492, and there was a gentleman named Christopher Columbus, and Monday is actually Columbus Day. So, and we don't have school off, but when you hear people say Columbus Day, just know that that's what they're talking about. They're talking about when Columbus sailed the Atlantic Ocean and supposedly founded this land.
My uncle said that Christopher Columbus was the first one to discover that the Earth was circular.
That the Earth was round as opposed to flat. I don't know if he was the first one to do that, but I don't know if they had the technology back then. He's probably the first one to believe that and make an assumption on that. So anyways, I need voices off, and I should see all eyes. I need voice off, I should see all eyes. Okay, it's important to know that A, he was an Italian, and that B, he had this really bold idea. And his idea was that, first of all, he was an explorer. So that's what he wanted to do. Just like the only reason that we're here, so you can find out what you want to do in life, how you can contribute to the rest of the world, and we give you the tools in order to be able to do that. Okay, so he knew that he wanted to be an explorer. And he wanted to find a new and better way to reach the Indies. So the Indies was this certain part of Asia, but ignorantly, because he had a lack of technology, he ended up going a completely different route and finding his way to what we call the Bahamas, which he still thought was the Indies, but it was nowhere near that at all. So he ended up having to call it the West Indies. Just press enter. Or not.
Look, got a lot of editing.
I always have to do editing. Okay, so he wanted to find a better way to reach the Indies, which was a part of Asia. And it was a part of Asia that was rich with gold, spices, and other things. So back then, they didn't have any means of going to a grocery store to get the things that they wanted. They had to produce the things that were natural resources in the area that they lived in, and they could only trade with other areas of the world that had their natural resources. Okay, there were no marketplaces that just had a plethora of everything. Those marketplaces that probably exist had to trade with other places from around the world. So anyways, so he took his plan to Spain's king and queen and convinced them that he could find a cheaper and quicker way to the Indies. So right here, I want you to make an inference in your notes. So next to the second bullet point, make an inference. Why do you think he had to take his plan to Spain's king and queen? Now he's Italian, and he had to take his plan to Spain's king and queen to try to convince them that he could find this new and better way. Okay? Because the way that they had was to go across land and to try to get to the West Indies that way. And it was too long, it took too long to get the goods back. So you write it in your notes, that's all you're doing. You're making an inference in your notes on the same sheet. And label it inference. Label it inference. Why do you think he had to go to Spain's king and queen in order to get this, to get them to believe that he could do this in a cheaper way?
You say that again?
Yeah, so you make an inference of why Columbus took his plan to Spain's king and queen to convince them that he could find this cheaper way to get to the West Indies. Or really it was the East Indies. But why do you think he had to try to convince them? Okay, so he sailed for a little over 2 months, and he finally got to his destination. And he saw land, and he claimed this island for the Spanish king and queen. Okay, historians believe that Columbus may have reached one of the Bahama Islands, which became known as the West Indies. So again, he didn't have any technology. All he had was probably a compass. He definitely didn't have a motorized ship by any means. He didn't have an iPhone to tell him where he was. He couldn't look on the satellite. He couldn't use Google Maps. He couldn't use any of that. All he had was the sail on his ship and probably a compass. Okay, and he was sailing out on the Atlantic Ocean. So ignorantly, he thought he reached one destination and he ended up in another. So he called this area the West Indies, but really he should have been east. So he was just below Florida and the Virgin Islands, where we know that Rihanna and Nicki Minaj are from the Virgin Islands. And the Bahamas is a part of those Virgin Islands. And when he got there, he believed that he had reached the Indies, and he called the people Indians. Because he believed he reached the Indies, he called the people Indians. This name later referred to the native people of the Americas. Shouldn't be an N on that. The native people of the Americas. So originally there were people who were already here, and they were the Native Americans. Okay, they were Americans. They were native to this land. That's why we call them Native Americans. But ignorantly, we confused them and called them Indians because of Christopher Columbus's, I guess we can say, confusion. Okay, so he thought he was in the West Indies, so that's why he called them Indians. Okay, but just know that they're really not Indians, because they're not from India. They're Americans. They're Native Americans. So he found the entirely wrong area of the globe to be in, but Spain was able to use these lemons and turn them into lemonade. So they used it to their advantage. So they had a brand new goal for this trip. And this goal was to start a colony that would bring profits to Spain. And a colony is a settlement far from the country that rules it. So it's like if they bought a second house, not a new house, a second one. So they wanted to have people who actually lived in both places. Thus, the Columbian Exchange had begun. So once they built on the land of America, they were able to use that in order to trade goods. So this was a movement of people, animals, plants, diseases, and ways of life. So wherever people go, just know that diseases go with them. Okay, but they also took some of their stuff because they don't know what to expect in this new land. So they had to take animals because they had to take food. They had to take plants because they had to take things that they were used to eating. Okay? But many Native Americans died because those Native Americans had no defense against smallpox and measles. So we can readily assume that the Spanish people brought what diseases? Smallpox and measles, okay?
Chickenpox.
We can't make that assumption, but we can assume that they brought these because these were the ones that the Native Americans had no defenses against. So usually, every area of the world has its own diseases that are unique unto that area. And doctors and physicians in that area create medicine that can get rid of those diseases. So because the Native Americans had never experienced those diseases, they had no type of defense against those types of illnesses. Okay? Their entire way of life was changed. Many were forced to work on large farms growing sugarcane and other crops. So the Native Americans were the first people to be this land. So it didn't start off with African Americans, it started off with the people who already lived here. They were forced to work the land in order to grow things so people could eat and live. And this was called the Columbian Exchange. So the first couple of slides we were talking about, it dealt with the journey of Christopher Columbus, which today is Columbus Day, and him asking the king and queen of Spain if he could make this new discovery journey to this land of what's going to be America. But now we're talking about a different set of people. We're talking about people not from Spain or Italy. We're talking about people from England. And so the story of the Pilgrims, how many people know about the story of the Pilgrims and the Puritans? One person? Wow, I thought that was an elementary school standard. So, the story of the Pilgrims, which a pilgrim is a person who journeys for religious reasons, begins in England during the early 1500s. Okay, they came to America to explore, to gain wealth, in search of religious freedom, and to live on land of their own. So they heard about this place called, well, I don't think it achieved the name of America just yet, but they heard about this new land that supposedly had been discovered. And so they were having issues in England with the king and queen and being able to worship the way that they want to. Okay? And they were Christians. So they decided to pack up and to be adventurous and daring and to go ahead and venture off to this new land. In September 1620, about 100 pilgrims crowded into a small ship called Mayflower and journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean. So when we think of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, we also think of Thanksgiving, okay? Because these were the people who actually invented the first Thanksgiving. So what do we think of when we think of, what do you think of when you think of Thanksgiving? Food. Giving, good. Food and giving, what else? Family. We said food, but turkey. Who? Parties. So, but when we think of Thanksgiving, we think of, well, what's in the name? Thanks. Yeah, when we think of Thanksgiving, we think of being thankful. Okay, or we should. We should think of being thankful because that's why they had the first Thanksgiving. They had the very first Thanksgiving because they were thankful that they were able to, first of all, make that journey safely. It wasn't an easy journey. And they were thankful that they were able to get to land that they could actually cultivate, and they were able to grow food and to eat and to survive and live and to worship the way that they want to worship. Okay, so as you're copying, I'm just going to read to you a little bit out of this book that I have called If You Were at the First Thanksgiving. I'm just reading the first page and a half. How it all began. In 1620, a small group of people landed on the coast of Massachusetts. They were the Pilgrims, and they came from England to make a new home in America. At that time, there were no other Europeans living in New England. So New England would have been the new territory here in America. Regular England would have been the land that they came from. At that time, there were no other Europeans living in New England. The Pilgrims were the very first to settle there. Their ship, the Mayflower, arrived late in the year. It was winter, and the settlers had to build their houses in the snow and freezing rain. Even their temporary home on the Mayflower was cold and damp. Everyone was coughing and getting sick. Many came down with pneumonia. By spring, half the Pilgrims had died. Only 52 people were left. 22 of them were children under the age of 16. The Pilgrims, however, refused to give up. They wanted to stay in Plymouth. But could they survive in this wild new land? Could they grow enough food? Would the Indians who lived there attack them? By fall, they had their answer. Their fields were full of ripe corn and other vegetables. Now there was enough food to last through the winter, and there was peace with their Indian neighbors. To celebrate, the Pilgrims decided to have a big party, a harvest festival. And they invited their new Indian friends to join them. For the Pilgrims knew that without the Indians' help, they would never have survived. Today, we call this harvest festival the first Thanksgiving. So, the difference between the Spanish settlers with Christopher Columbus and the European settlers with the Pilgrims is that the Spanish settlers with Christopher Columbus, first of all, they landed much further south, Gabby. They landed much further south in the Bahamas, and they enslaved the Native Americans. Okay, they didn't try to work with them, Gabby. I'm over here. Come over here. Thank you. So they didn't try to work with the Native Americans. They enslaved them and made them work the land. But the Pilgrims, they worked with the Native Americans, and they helped them and they befriended them, and they had their first Thanksgiving with them. Okay, so that was the difference between the two. Next slide. All right, we should be copying. All right, so Ms. Dell, we should be copying. Okay, so the New England economy was based on products from the forests and the sea. So these are the Puritans. So by this time, they've worked the land, and they've made some type of a trade industry where they've used their natural resources in order to trade with things that were natural resources from people in the southern part of the country. So the New England economy, where the Puritans were, was based on products from the forests and the sea. And the economy of the Middle Colonies was based on farm products and valuable minerals such as iron. The Southern Colonies had farms that ranged from small family farms to large plantations powered by the work of slaves. Okay, so this is why we have so many plantations that are down south. That's where they originated from. Okay, up north, they didn't have to use slaves as much. Okay, they were able to work the forest themselves. They were able to work the seas themselves. When we think of New England and we think of the fact that they worked the sea, what soup do we think of? So when we think of New England and the fact that one of their natural resources is, sea life, there's a soup that is entitled New England such and such. No, it's a soup. What soup do we call New England, and it has something to do with, yes, thank you. Okay, so that's an example of New England using their natural resources to trade. Okay, when we think of New England, we think of New England clam chowder. Anyway, this is your last slide, but an important part of colonial trade. So colonial trade was what we just described, the fact that they had to use their natural resources and trade them. Blocker, your copy. Thank you. So an important part of colonial trade was the slave trade. Okay, they carried guns and other goods to ports on the coast of West Africa, and they traded these goods for gold and captive Africans. Okay, so in order to get these Africans, they had to go and kind of have something to wager. So they said, well, we have guns. How would y'all like some guns? You don't have this, do you? No. So they went with guns, and the guns were very enticing to these African queens and kings, and they were able to trade these slaves for those guns and other products. Okay? So just know that the Africans were actually sold from the people who, from the African kings and queens. So a lot of times we think that these European people went and stole and kidnapped these slaves from Africa, and they didn't. They didn't force these people just into slavery. These people were sold by Africans. Okay. The ship then sailed for the West Indies or the Bahamas, as we said. Okay, which is right below Florida. And we also know that Rihanna and Nicki Minaj are from that area. Okay. The ship then sailed for the West Indies because it was the second leg of the voyage. It was known as the Middle Passage. So this would be a nice test question. So when it left Africa, it went to the Bahamas, and that was called the Middle Passage. Okay, that was the only voyage that the slaves were on. Okay, so there were three main routes. The only one that the slaves were on was the Middle Passage. Captive Africans suffered terribly during the Middle Passage. Many died as a result of hunger, thirst, disease, or cruel treatment. The ships completed the triangle by carrying the sugar and molasses back to the colonial ports. So they would leave the colonial ports and they would go to Africa. They were with their guns. And they would trade these guns for slaves, and they would take the slaves and go down to the Bahamas where the plantations were. Because remember, the plantations were not up north, they were down south. So they get the slaves and take the slaves down south to the plantations. Then they would pick up what was produced from those plantations, which was sugar and molasses, which is like honey, and they would take this stuff to the colonies up north. So this was what the trade was like. They made a triangular trade just to get some sugar. Okay, because we all know how much we love sugar, and just to get some of that sugar, they went through all of this in their daily lives.